You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
I think that the social sciences sort of ended up by having this stalemate between agency and structure. And so you had to pick a side. And the real interesting questions are the interaction effects between agency and structure. And that's something that, Don stressed, and even, Don had some tussles with his dissertation advisor, Kersner, over this issue. Because I think it's kind of an intriguing question about where you see the universality of economics lying. And so to me, and everything that you're saying, the fact that individuals are going to try to respond the best they can to the circumstances is the theory, right? At some level, that sounds simple, but that's a theory. But the manifestation of what those best responses are completely context specific. And we end up by missing this. It's kind of like in a lot of economics, loose thinking of economics, when you say demand curve slope downward, but you forget to recognize that you still have to then talk about the slope of the demand curve before you can say anything in the applied world about what's going on with things. So about the magnitude of effects of any of this stuff. I mean, you have the effect, but not, I like to summarize Vernon Smith's Nobel lecture, which is on ecological versus constructivist rationality, in the following sense: that the ecological rationality point says that human beings are omnipresent, are constantly rational. The question is that the manifestation of their rationality is context specific. Right. So like what it means for them to be rational. So what does it mean for a female entrepreneur in Ghana to actually, behave in the best response policy? You don't know that outside of the details about what the hell she's facing in her situation in Ghana. Finance, legal, cultural, all that stuff like that,
Right.
And so, so to me, I think the Austrians, the biggest missed opportunity in the Austrians, and it goes all the way back a long way. It's back to when they were in Vienna, is that their cultural context of doing the science of economics would have placed them in the realm of economic sociology as it evolved in the second half of the 20th century in the US. But they just thought that's what you did as economists. So like to them, institutions are always part of economics. Whereas to the neoclassical model, you were supposed to have an institutionally antiseptic theory, right? I mean, that was the goal. And so, Hayek in that regard, people think when he writes The Road to Serfdom or The Constitution of Liberty, he's left economics. But the reality is he's actually still doing economics. He's just focusing on the institutional framework within which exchange processes take place. It's just that no one else in the United States was doing that. And so they're like looking at it like a weird thing until Buchanan and then North and all the rest of these guys do it. And so, to me, I think it's just, we got waylaid in economics because of what we thought theory was. And then we get waylaid in applied economics by what we think empirics is. And we end up by, I just reviewed McCloskey's new book, Beyond Positivism, Behavioralism, and Neo-Institutionalism in Economics. Mm-hmm. She has a great line in there where she says that we need a more rigorous but richer theory and a more, basically historical and true empirical economics, as opposed to just, tests of statistical significance and what she calls, proof, theorem proof economics, kind of thing. And I think she's right. And but it's a battle, I think, that we're gonna have to face. But this is a good segue into my next question, because again, a lot of this stuff that we're doing, you and I share so many tacit presuppositions because of our teacher, and the framing in which Don, put things to us. One of his famous essays, right, is between formalism and historicism, right? I mean, he's trying to find that ground. So let me talk about Don as a liberal, though, so in Don's National Economic Planning, What is Left? Chapter 7 of that book is the closest thing that we have to his kind of manifesto about what a liberal society would be. I did an interview recently about Don, and the question was put to me is, why is Don not as well known as,
this is the essay, or this is the interview you did with Aaron Ross Powell?
No, this is a more recent one that I did with Juliet Selgren.
Okay.
The great antidote. It's the Adam Smith Works project over at Liberty Fund. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to do one on Don Lavoie. And so she interviewed me and she asked me this question. And I said, look, the sad truth is Don died young, and so that's just the sad reality of things, is he just died at a very young age. And so he never got to write his, Understanding Political Economy treatise, which he was working on and things like that. But in the National Economic Planning, What is Left, he uses the term like interchangeably, libertarianism and radical liberalism. And, why do you think that so much of libertarian thinking seems to have lost its bearings? And so we get a kind of weird illiberal libertarianism, so that now we must, in fact, as you point out in your essay, we have to reclaim the name, liberalism, but we also have to insist that liberalism is liberal. Right? Like, remember, folks, liberalism is liberal. We treat one another as one and I dignified equals, right? There's no hierarchies. There's, the whole thing. I mean, it's just, it's always amazing to me that people somehow think of, liberalism or libertarianism, and then the next thing they see is it's connected to the rise of oligarchs and monopoly, privileges and stuff like that, which is, as Lavoie pointed out in that book, going all the way back to the levelers, all the way through, the history of liberalism is one of small, constant struggles to defeat the power of the privileged, to have hierarchies, to overcome things. And so, as you're thinking about Don's project and now your four corners of liberalism, where did the libertarian project go wrong, so that now we have to do this reclaiming of the soul of our project? I don't know if that question makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I have the answer on the libertarian movement as a whole, because there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to, let's start with the fact that many people who claim the label are anything but liberals, right? In any form, right? In any form. So just calling BS where we need to on people who claim that mantle of whether it's, if they're in favor of any kind of freedom-based ideological movement, we need just to call BS on it if that's not what they're about. And then there's I think another facet of this, which is something we were chatting about before we started to hit the record button, is those intellectual proponents of a free society, why haven't they been more persuasive across the board. I think that's something that I've thought about a lot more, because that's in the intellectual space, rather than the sort of like, activism or politics space. But I think it has something to do with this, and it does come back to Don's vision. And it also, and if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'd like to go back to the four corners on this piece, because I think that with each of the four corners, there's a narrow sort of necessary piece of or view, a necessary view, and then there's a more expansive view of each of the four corners. So, for example, political liberalism has a sort of like, what at its core is it? It would be something like a commitment to limited government, where its job is to protect our individual liberty, the rights that we have as individuals. I have no quarrel with that starting point, because that is a necessary piece of the liberal project. And what I'm about to say isn't to quarrel with it at all. It's just to suggest that that is the sort of minimalist necessary piece of the political liberalism piece of the project. But it's so much more than that, right? And this is the more expansive view. It's, we want a limited government, not as just an end in and of itself, right? We want to limit the government so that we have maximal freedom of, for example, freedom of association, right? We get Tocquevillian art of association in part because the state is constrained from creeping in too ferociously into these other dimensions of our lives. It gives the rest of our civic life some space, some oxygen, so it can breathe and thrive and actually do work, because that's how civil society grows and gets more robust. It actually has to do work. And if government encroaches so much, even if it's well-meaning in its encroachment, it snuffs out that space where civil society can thrive. I think there's another version of this over on the economic liberalism corner, which is that the sort of like necessary but limited view is one of just sort of like economic freedom, full stop. Again, we have to have a commitment to the sort of mechanisms that allow for experimentation and innovation and the free exchange, the voluntary exchange of goods and services. We need that sort of necessary piece of it. But the more expansive view that builds on that, where we can get to, is an awe-inspiring system of human connection and cooperation, right? Going back to my days as, thinking about women in the developing world, what struck me with the sort of boots on the ground approach that I've always favored in terms of my empirical research, is that seeing up close how freaking hard women work in poor societies. I kind of always fancied myself as someone who has a strong work ethic, and I look at what these women do on a daily basis, day after day after day, and it's like whatever I could put up against that in terms of comparing my work ethic to theirs, no freaking contest, no contest, right? What's the difference though? Why am I so benefited? It's not because I'm smarter. It's not because I work harder. Neither of those two things is true. It's because I've got access to the extended order. And so the most emancipating thing we could do is find ways to extend access to this great system of human connection and cooperation. Like, That's what economic, so there's a very narrow view of economic freedom, but there's this more maximal or expansive view of economic freedom as well. And, it's like you could do the same thing with cultural liberalism. We do need that core starting point of toleration. Like we got to start, toleration is a big piece of it.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the Steve Horowitz, our dear friend who passed away? He loved to point out this video by Hans Riesling on the washing machine.
Yeah.
So many of us know the Hans Riesling, the 200 countries over 200 years in 4 minutes. But he also did one on the washing machine, and what that delivered in terms of amazing time saving and productivity increases for women, around the world with all of this. But I have a hypothesis.
And because what comes out of the washing machine are books.
Yeah.
That she can read, and she can read to her children, right. And and this, I love the puppetry aspect of that piece. It's just amazing.
I have a hypothesis, which is that in the four corners, that the economic liberal component is the most counterintuitive, and therefore those who are somehow get linked in to understanding through the economic way of thinking that corner, they sometimes use economics as a bludgeon, as you mentioned before, against what they think are these encroachments by people that really should be their allies but don't understand the economic corner, right? And it produced, I think, among people what I call, Rosalino Candela and I have a piece trying to respond to Sam Friedman's illiberal libertarianism piece. We have a piece called Liberal Libertarianism. And in that, we describe what we call litmus test libertarianism, which is when young people, especially young men, get, first learn economic way of thinking. The scales fall from their eyes. They have this road to Damascus kind of idea, and they want to share the good news with everyone. But the sharing of the good news isn't an inviting; it's actually an indicting. It's like, how can you believe such silly things that economic, trade isn't producing wealth or whatever? And so what they hold is they take the most obnoxious position possible with your minimum necessary condition, and then hold that up. And if you walk away from it by saying, that's not the way I would put things, or, that's really, you really shouldn't make that argument or whatever, they think, so you must not be willing to bite the bullet and be a real libertarian, kind of thing. And this has affected our cultural and our intellectual movement. It's kind of, one of our mutual teachers, Bob Tullison, used to say all the time to me, joking around, he'd say, if we don't believe in homo economicus, Pete, who will? Right. So the subtlety gets drained, and it's just this blunt instrument kind of idea. Don was always trying to get us to think about the subtleties involved, and whatnot, and so I appreciate that this is one of the things I appreciate in Jim Buchanan, who's a more subtle thinker than Gordon Tullock, right? Gordon Tullock's more blunt instrument thinker, right? Or Kenneth Boulding, who is a more subtle thinker than a blunt instrument type person. And you could say that about Hayek, that is more subtle than a blunt instrument kind of reasoning. And so I think that might be necessary as an attitude issue, which is in the openness, humility, and optimism, right? Kind of idea.
Yes. Yeah. So if you're an economic liberal, you're very likely to have a kind of default optimism in the face of economic disruption and change, because we understand that even if I don't know and certainly can't name what the solution to the present moment will be, that I know something about the way that markets marshal creative forces and solutions bubble up. This is the sort of Julian Simon point about the ultimate resource, right? So to me, it is a fairly simple matter of flipping that to cultural liberalism as well. That there is, and that puzzles me as to why, say, social conservatives are so frightened of cultural liberalism and so, just want to, kind of put the brakes on, who would otherwise want to limit government power, to use government power to put the brakes on cultural experimentation and evolution. It seems to me that there's not enough faith in the things that they say they want to preserve and care about deeply. So family being one of them, and it's like I'm super excited about this sort of experimental language and practice around. You'll hear it popping up now, saying my chosen family was there for me in this tumultuous time. My chosen family really came through for me. And what that's standing in for is I was somehow a disappointment to my traditional family, maybe because of the partner I choose or who I fell in love with. And my chosen family was there, and that was as real a family as what was supposed to be, the family structure and what it could deliver to me. It didn't deliver, and this did, right? And to me, I think that, and then we're seeing legal innovations that allow for enduring, bonds to that are so that this is not just ephemeral and not just at the level of, say, a friendship that could build or die off, but we're going to commit to each other through some form of legal contract. That the evolution in law around this kind of arrangement, I don't know if it's going to work, but what's interesting is that people are trying to hold on to something that is central to what they consider to be family. And so I would claim that if I were a social conservative, I would claim that as a victory. And I would want to support those if family structure is the thing that binds society together, and that's where I'm putting all my chits on the table for. What I ought to be in favor of is ways in which families can be intact and have a kind of resilience built into the system.
One of the things that I really reading, one thing that is interesting is take your four corners and then read back classic writings in liberalism. So, for example, think back to Hayek's, what he's trying to do in the Constitution of Liberty, because the chapter on the creative powers of free civilization, right, is right along your lines. I mean, it's not just about the economics of it; it's about the intellectual ideas about it. Read back into McCloskey's trilogy, right, and what she's identifying is not only, it's your package point, right, is that not only are you going to have these great innovations of tinkering of technologies, but you're going to have art, music, literature that is just comes from this kind of idea. And so I think it's really important to understand not only that chapter in Hayek about the creative powers, but then also reread his essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, in light of what you're saying. Because the reason why he is not a conservative is because the conservatives are, in fact, blocking off the adaptation to change and the need to not only engage in constant adaptations to change, but prepare ourselves for readaptations to changing circumstances that are involved. and that's what living a life is constituted of, right? Is actually bobbing and weaving, as they would say.
Can I throw something out to you?
Yeah.
All right. So like, I've been working on this, kind of based on this sort of four corners idea. I've been working on unpacking what it would mean to what are the elements of a liberal sensibility, and I starting with if you're a liberal, the first thing you'll say is that this is not a project. The liberal project is not about imposing any end state of the good, right? That is the liberal political piece of the project, is to say government should not be in the business of telling us what is the good and enforcing it, right? That it doesn't know enough, and it's and if as soon as it supposes that it does and it's imposing upon us, our political liberties are destroyed. So with that as the baseline, I think that there is and this goes back to sort of like where did we take wrong turns? You've written about we took a wrong turn by tying ourselves tying market principles to neoclassical understandings of Homo economicus, right? Like, that took a wrong turn. Maybe there's a wrong turn here as well, in that if we stop at the point where we say, look, there is no liberal end state or imposed end telos of the liberal order that government is going to orchestrate. We're all in agreement. If we're liberals, we're all in agreement around that. But as liberals, then our next step is to say, right, it's not the government's purview to tell us what the good is. It's ours. It's ours. And I think that as intellectual liberals, we're somewhat reticent to talk about liberal virtues. We're reticent to talk about liberal sensibilities, default postures that lean towards and reinforce the norms of liberal society, even though no one's imposing them, or no one's advocating that they be imposed. But I really think this is part of the problem that we're in. We have a tremendous degradation of or threats to the political liberal order, in part because we had political leaders who, without apology, transgressed against liberal norms, and they bore no responsibility or no accountability for violating liberal norms. That's a real problem, right? And so, when I think about the liberal sensibility, why it matters is that it's if I do think that most of us in society are more or less advocates of some version of the liberal democratic order. We may or may not have really principled understandings of, economic principles, or right, all that being said, most people want the benefits of a market-based society in a liberal democratic order. But we're not pulling our weight if we're allowing people to get away with this kind of systematic corrosion of liberal norms. And so I think that there's value in naming what the liberal norms are, not as a project of imposing our will, but as a project that says, as members of civil society, scholars need to be in this game.
I think that's very wise. I'm very mindful of the time, and I have one last question, which relates to a Harper Magazine symposium that's running this February. It just was released earlier this week, but it's a roundtable conversation on the topic, is liberalism worth saving? And it involves a conversation between Patrick Deneen, Frank Fukuyama, Deirdre McCloskey, and Cornel West. And it's McCloskey stands out very much in this conversation because of her economic liberalism. Deneen is rejecting all four of the, in many ways, because Deneen wants to have a telos, right? Wants to have an overarching telos, a purpose, a truth that somehow is in our political culture or whatever. But Cornel West and Frank Fukuyama are interesting characters because they're embracing, in some sense, these tensions that you're talking about, and they become frustrated aspects with their earlier positions on things. But at the end of the day, they join Deneen in being very pessimistic about the liberal project. Whereas McCloskey, yourself, our group in general or whatever, is more optimistic and believe in the possibility of a better world, through freedom. How do you negotiate the intellectual space that you're occupying with this kind of broad conversation? I mean, at one level, it's an amazingly welcome thing that, on Harper's Magazine, they're debating the very thing that you are working on and everything. I mean, how many people are reading that? It's like a huge space, right? And whatnot. But on another level, it seems strange that people are writing the obituary of this liberal project. So just to finish up, I mean, how are you envisioning your engagements in this broader sense, and the success or frustrations you've had in trying to communicate your four corners idea in this intellectual space?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the sense that I had as just starting out as an economist, that you kind of had to have a conversation on two fronts all the time.
So you're sharpening those elbows.
Yeah. And maybe I need to change the metaphor. Maybe it's, just like bigger hugs, I don't know. But it goes back to Don as the best teacher on any of this, right? And to your point about as freaked out and genuinely concerned I'm actually very concerned about the future of the liberal project, not because so much that there are, intellectuals who are, kind of chipping away at it, though that needs a response, and Deirdre's work is so important in that space, but more about things like the forgetting, the massive forgetting. Right. So like one of the things that was helpful in the Cold War times is that you had a kind of a thing that you could point to. If you could point to, that's what you get in a Soviet style economy. If government it sees its role as engineering and coordinating the economy. That's the outcome. So making the connections between political freedom and economic freedom, you could point to some very real examples. You can point to real examples today too, but it wasn't as much in the zeitgeist of the public, and so that had value in the sense of you could kind of keep people, even if they were resistant to how far you might want to go or I might want to go with economic liberalism, that there was still a kind of, everybody was still on team liberalism. Even if they wouldn't put it that way, we sort of assumed that the direction that the typical Soviet citizen, what they wanted most was the freedoms we had in the United States, as imperfectly exercised as that was even at the time, right? There was an assumption that more liberality was the direction that the world wanted to go. There was the assumption that that just respectable, polite society was one in which we wanted greater expansive civil liberties across the board, and where they were, where there was power inappropriately asserted, it didn't matter whether you were, which party you voted for, you would call that out, kind of thing. And that has, for a variety of reasons, and in part because of the sort of the quote unquote moment of the end of history, the 1989 moment. Well, it's like, well, we won the so-called battle of ideas. We could then, kind of relax back and stop having to argue in the mode of liberal scholars anymore, and in the mode of liberal public intellectuals, or policymakers, or political actors. You didn't have to nod to that baseline anymore, and that I think has made us forget in some very profound ways that we are, in fact, most of us are liberals, right? That if we think about our fellow citizens, if you go down, sort of issue by issue, right? I like the work that Todd Rose is doing at Harvard around, the massive degree of agreement on some core basic liberal principles across society, and yet we have forgotten the package that brought us those good things. We've lost the language that brought us those good things. We've lost the sort of intellectual arguments that allow us to connect dots that are not obvious, that lead to liberal principles. We've lost the default liberal impulses that lead to, default to optimism in the face of challenge, and these sorts of things. So that makes me very, very concerned. At the same time, I am also incredibly optimistic. For one, like you say, there is intellectual debate around liberalism, and so perhaps the forgetting can be reversed, right? So that's valuable. And the other is, I look at the way in which people respond with what I would describe as basically liberal impulses in the face of illiberalism. It's a news story, and people are, just shocked, when they hear of the protests and the reasons for the protest in Iran, the annihilation of education for girls and women in Afghanistan. We react in a way, I think the general public reacts in a way that betrays, in a very good way, their knee-jerk liberal principles, right? If they learn about how the Uyghurs are being treated in China, or what's happening with press freedoms in Hong Kong, their knee-jerk reaction is a liberal reaction. And that's what gives me hope. And we have a community of scholars who see what's behind that hope, who see the intellectual tradition that is the wellspring of that impulse, the willingness and ability to apply those principles to really complex and novel challenges when they don't know what the answer is, right? The pandemic is a great example of things that were offered up. The post George Floyd moment, another example of challenges that are offered up, where that is a classic liberal challenge. We need a state that is strong enough to keep us from predating against each other, but we also need to figure out how we solve the problem, the Madisonian problem, that the state doesn't predate against us, right? That's a classic liberal challenge. And it's a challenge because there isn't an easy answer to it. And that's why we need the brightest minds diving in deep to the liberal project. And so that's, again, because it's a thing again to worry about, to think about, that also gives me hope.
Well, Emily, that's a fantastic note to end on. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. And I have to say, the work that you're doing is just fantastic. So keep it up. And I hope that we can have this conversation again in another, few months, and we can see how we're both trying to push the frontiers out, because we have hope that we can, as Steve always used to say, repair a broken world. So
Indeed. Thank you for this opportunity, Pete. It's always great to see you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.